On June 8th in 2018, Anthony Bourdain was found dead in his hotel room in France. He was 61 years old. For millions of people, it was shocking. For chefs, it was devastating. But from the outside, Anthony Bourdain had everything. He had escaped the kitchen. He had traveled the world, shared meals with presidents, street vendors, refugees, artists, and complete strangers. He had become one of the most respected voices in food, maybe the most respected. So when the news broke, there was only one question every chef quietly asked themselves. If Anthony Bourdain couldn't make it, what chance did the rest of us have? Because for many chefs, it felt impossible to understand. If someone as respected as Anthony Bourdain could still be suffering, maybe success had never been the answer. But Anthony Bourdain's story isn't really about how it ended. It's about why millions of people, especially cooks, felt like they had lost one of their own. Because before he became a television host, he became an author. Before the world knew his name, Anthony Bourdain was exactly who he always claimed to be, just another cook. If you're into stories like this, about chefs, restaurants, and the art of cooking great food, subscribe to the channel for more. And if you enjoyed the video, leaving a like really helps more than you think. Anthony Bourdain didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a celebrity. In fact, he didn't even dream of becoming a chef. As a teenager, he spent summers in Provincetown, Massachusetts, washing dishes in a seafood restaurant. It wasn't glamorous, the pay was terrible, the hours were even worse. But somewhere between the noise, the heat, and the organized chaos, he found something that made sense: a professional kitchen. He enrolled in the Culinary Institute of America and graduated in 1978, and then stepped into the New York City restaurant scene. If this was another chef story, this is where we talked about Michelin stars and legendary mentors, or a restaurant that changed everything. But Anthony Bourdain's career didn't look like that. He bounced from kitchen to kitchen, some good, some forgettable, some barely hanging on. Like thousands of cooks in New York, he lived paycheck to paycheck, worked holidays, missed birthdays, burned himself, cut himself, started over, again and again and again. Years passed, then more years. Most ambitious young chefs imagine they're only a few years away from opening their own spot. Anthony Bourdain stopped imagining. He simply cooked. The kitchen became everything: his family, his routine, his identity. It was also where he developed the addictions that would follow him. Like many cooks of that era, he became caught in a cycle of heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. Eventually, Bourdain got clean, but recovery didn't erase the struggle. It simply became part of his life. Meanwhile, his career stayed almost exactly where it had always been. By the mid-1990s, Anthony Bourdain was the head chef at Legacies, a bustling French brasserie in Manhattan. It was a good restaurant, a respected restaurant, but certainly not one that made headlines. He was in his 40s, still working the line, still managing cooks, still wondering if this was simply his story. And honestly, he'd made peace with that, because not every cook becomes famous. Most don't. Most spend their entire careers behind swinging kitchen doors, creating meals, solving problems, and going home after midnight knowing nobody outside those walls will ever know their name. Anthony Bourdain believed he'd be one of them. He had no idea that a single essay was about to change not only his own life, but the way the entire world understood restaurants. The article wasn't supposed to make him famous. It was supposed to let him vent. Instead, it pulled back the curtain on an industry that had spent generations hiding its secrets. By the late 1990s, Anthony Bourdain had spent enough time inside kitchens to understand something most people never saw. The restaurant industry had two completely different faces: the one customers experienced, and the one hidden beneath the surface. The dining room was precision, but the kitchen was survival. Restaurants were built around an image of perfection, but the reality was far messier. The burns, the exhaustion, the impossible hours, the addictions, the brutal hierarchy. The people whose work made restaurants run, but whose names nobody ever knew. For decades, the industry accepted this contradiction. Anthony Bourdain was one of the first people willing to expose it. In 1999, he wrote an essay for The New Yorker. It was called, "Don't Eat Before Reading This." It wasn't written to launch a new career. It wasn't written to expose the industry. And it certainly wasn't written with Hollywood in mind. It was simply one cook finally telling the truth about everything. The things diners never knew, the things cooks laughed about, the things restaurant owners hoped nobody would ever say publicly. The response was immediate. People couldn't stop talking about it.
Chef Bourdain shed his kitchen whites to shed some light on the business he's been in for more than a decade.
I was in a cranky mood after my last restaurant closed and felt no reason not to tell the truth about a business I both love and have mixed emotions about. You are less likely to receive fresh fish on a Monday or a Sunday or a Monday than you are on a Tuesday. That's just because of the market forces. Somebody who orders their meat cooked to shoe leather consistency is less likely to notice a more tough piece of meat or an older piece of meat than someone who eats their meat properly cooked.
Publishers took notice, and 1 year later, that essay became a book, Kitchen Confidential. Nobody expected what happened next, least of all Anthony Bourdain. The book exploded. It became a bestseller almost overnight, but not because it was teaching people how to cook. It wasn't. It was teaching people how restaurants actually worked. He talked openly about drugs, violence, kitchen hierarchy, impossible hours, food safety, the pirate culture that existed behind the swinging kitchen doors. For many diners, it was shocking. For cooks, it felt like recognition. For the first time, someone had described their lives exactly as they were. Not polished, not romanticized, just honest. And honesty created trust. That's why chefs loved Anthony Bourdain. He called himself a journeyman, a competent cook, nothing more. What people admired was that he never pretended. He wasn't selling perfection. He wasn't building a personal brand. He wasn't trying to become a celebrity. He was giving a voice to people who'd spent their entire careers without one. The dishwasher, the outlaw prep cook, the immigrant line cook, the woman working pastry through the night, the pastry chef wondering if another 60-hour week was worth it. Anthony Bourdain made them visible, and they never forgot. But something unexpected happened. The book didn't end his career in restaurants. It ended his life as a restaurant chef. Because once the world heard Anthony Bourdain's voice, it wanted to hear a lot more of it. Suddenly, the cook who had spent 28 years hidden behind a stove was being asked to show the world what existed beyond it. In 2002, Anthony Bourdain stepped onto an airplane with a camera crew. He thought he was making another food show. He wasn't. Without realizing it, he was about to reinvent travel television. Anthony Bourdain didn't leave the kitchen because he stopped loving food. He left because he realized food was never really the thing he was chasing. Food was the doorway, the invitation, the reason strangers would sit across from each other and start talking. In 2002, after the success of Kitchen Confidential, Bourdain released A Cook's Tour. The concept was simple: travel around the world, eat local food, meet interesting people. It sounded like a traditional food show, but almost immediately it became something different. Because Anthony Bourdain wasn't interested in showing people the best restaurants. He was interested in showing people the world. Most food television at the time followed a familiar formula. Find the famous restaurant, meet the famous chef, show the audience something they couldn't experience themselves. Bourdain flipped that idea completely. He went looking for the people who were usually ignored: the street vendor, the fisherman, the grandmother cooking a family recipe, the person whose name would never appear on a restaurant sign. He wasn't interested in food as a luxury. He was interested in food as a language, the way people communicate who they are. But the most important thing Anthony Bourdain discovered was that the most interesting stories weren't always the ones on the other side of the world. Sometimes they were sitting right across the table. In 2005, Bourdain began hosting No Reservations, and this was where his voice truly started to evolve. The chef was still there, but something else was emerging: the storyteller. He wasn't just asking, "What are we eating?" He was asking, "Why does this matter? Why does this food exist? What history created it? What struggles shaped it? What does this meal tell us about the people who made it?" But there is another side of Anthony Bourdain's story that is often overlooked. Because while the world knew him for street food, local markets, and meals eaten at plastic tables, he never lost his appreciation for fine dining. He respected the discipline, the creativity, the obsession required to pursue excellence. Anthony Bourdain may not have built a Michelin-starred empire. He never chased awards, but he understood the people who did, because he understood what drove them: the endless repetition, the impossible standards, the belief that even the smallest detail mattered. The pursuit of excellence was something he recognized. Because whether it was a chef creating a perfect tasting menu in one of the world's greatest restaurants, or a journeyman cook making steak frites in a tiny Manhattan kitchen, or a street vendor preparing the dish they've made thousands of times, all of them came from the same place: a person caring deeply about what they created. Perhaps no relationship better represents this side of Anthony Bourdain than his friendship with Eric Ripert. Ripert was everything Bourdain was not: a refined master of one of America's greatest restaurants, a chef whose restaurant, the Bourdain, represented the highest level of classical fine dining. Bourdain represented rebellion. Ripert represented refinement. But the two understood each other, because underneath the differences, they were both cooks, both obsessed with their craft, both understood the sacrifices required to build something exceptional. Their friendship was proof that Anthony Bourdain wasn't against fine dining, he was against pretending that fine dining was the only thing that mattered. In 2006, while filming an episode of No Reservations in Beirut, Bourdain and his crew found themselves caught in the middle of a conflict between Israel and Hezbollah. What started as a food episode became something else entirely: a story about civilians caught in war, families forced from their homes, people whose lives suddenly defined by something far bigger than food. It was one of the moments that changed how people viewed Bourdain's work, because he wasn't just documenting meals anymore, he was documenting humanity.
I wasn't in Haifa. I wasn't in the north of Israel. I don't know what that was like. I was in Beirut.
In the few years since I've started a travelless world, I'd found myself changing. The cramped, cynical worldview of a man who'd only seen life through the narrow prism of the restaurant kitchen had altered. I'd been so many places, I'd met so many people from wildly divergent backgrounds, countries, and cultures. Everywhere I'd been, as in Beirut, treated so well. I'd been the recipient of so many random acts of kindness from strangers. And I'd begun to think that no matter where I went or who I sat down with, that food and a few drinks seemed always to bring people together. That this planet was filled with basically good and decent people doing the best they could, if frequently under difficult circumstances. That the human animal was perhaps a better and nicer species than I'd once thought. I'd begun to believe that the dinner table was the great leveler, where people from opposite sides of the world could always sit down and talk and eat and drink, and if not solve all the world's problems, at least find for a time common ground. Now, I'm not so sure. Maybe the world's not like that at all. Maybe in the real world, the one without cameras and happy food and travel shows, everybody, the good and the bad together, are all crushed under the same terrible wheel. I really hope I'm wrong about that.
That idea became the foundation of everything he did. Travel wasn't about collecting experiences. It was about challenging assumptions, about realizing that the people who seem different usually aren't that different at all. A meal could do something politics often couldn't. It could create a moment of understanding. A shared table could become a neutral ground. In 2013, Anthony Bourdain began his final and most ambitious series, Parts Unknown. And by this point, it was clear, this was no longer a food show. Food was still there, but by now, it was apparent his real subject was people. He traveled to places most television crews avoided: the Congo, Iran, Gaza, Myanmar, Libya, parts of America that rarely received attention. And everywhere he went, he approached people the same way, with curiosity, with respect, with the belief that their stories mattered. He didn't travel to explain the world, he traveled to connect to it. In 2016, Anthony Bourdain filmed one of the most memorable meals of his career. But it wasn't at a Michelin-starred restaurant. It wasn't behind a velvet rope. It was at a small restaurant in Hanoi, Vietnam. Sitting across from him was President Barack Obama, two of the most recognizable people in the world, sitting on tiny plastic stools, sharing a simple meal of bun cha. And somehow, That was exactly the point, because Anthony Bourdain has spent his entire career proving that a great meal wasn't defined by luxury. It was defined by connection. The person across the table mattered more than the status of the restaurant.
You're probably going to find out about it anyway, so here's a little preemptive truth-telling. There's no happy ending.
Be open to experience. Be willing to try new things. Don't have a rigid plan. Don't be afraid to wander. Don't be afraid to eat a bad meal. But I think most important, be humble, be grateful. Accept random acts of hospitality without judgment or fear. Be aware of the fact that you are probably the stupidest person in the room.
And that may have been Anthony Bourdain's greatest gift. He made people feel understood. Not famous people, not powerful people, ordinary people. The ones who are usually passed over. The ones whose stories rarely make the news. The ones who simply wanted someone to sit down and eat with them and listen. But while the world saw a man who had found freedom, the restaurant industry saw something else. They saw someone who finally understood what it costs to live this life. By the time Parts Unknown became one of the most respected shows on television, Bourdain had become something he never expected. A symbol. To the public, he represented a life most people could only dream about. But to chefs, he represented something much more personal. He represented someone who understood. Because long before Anthony Bourdain explored the world, he explored the restaurant industry, and he never forgot where he came from. One of the reasons cooks connected with Bourdain wasn't because he made their profession look glamorous. It was the opposite. He told the truth. Restaurants are built on passion, but they're also built on sacrifice, long hours, the physical exhaustion, the pressure. The people who spend their holidays and birthdays making memories for everyone else instead of making their own. For decades, the restaurant industry celebrated toughness. Bourdain was one of the first people with a large enough platform to ask, what does that toughness actually cost?
I've been in the restaurant business for 28 years. About 20 of those as a chef. I started as a dishwasher. I've been a line cook, a prep drone, a good cook, a bad cook, a good person and a bad person. I'm a changed person from the way I used to be.
What drives you to do this every single day? I don't know. You love it.
Seeing how many things you can make at the same time. Over here, I'm working the beef for the braised dobe of beef. Over here, we have tomato concasse working. Over there, sauce poivre reducing. And in here, our little friend, the boned out baby pig. Maybe you recognize him from such films as Babe, Pig in the City, and Babe, The Revenge. Cooks have traditionally been slaves from Roman times up until the mid-1800s. So far, I've found that all line cooks share the same sense of being outsiders, degraded, beaten down, underappreciated. Many of us have messy, dysfunctional, chaotic lives outside of the kitchen, but inside the kitchen we have the only order, the only structure in our life.
He talked openly about addiction years before it was common to talk about. He talked about burnout before the word became a part of everyday conversation. He talked about mental health in an industry where admitting you were struggling was often viewed as a weakness. And that, honestly, is why so many chefs trusted him. Not because he had all the answers, but because he admitted he didn't. And unfortunately, the struggles Anthony Bourdain talked about were not unique. The restaurant industry has long carried a culture of silence around mental health. The relentless pressure and expectation to simply push through. And the numbers show just how serious the problem is. According to the CDC, chefs and head cooks have among the highest rates of suicide of any occupation measured in the United States, with rates significantly elevated compared with other professions. But behind every statistic is a person, a cook walking home after a 14-hour shift, a chef carrying the pressure of an entire restaurant, someone who looks successful from the outside while struggling privately. And that was the conversation Anthony Bourdain helped bring into the open. The irony was, the man who spent his career telling everyone else to be honest about their struggles was still carrying his own. Anthony Bourdain had escaped the kitchen. He had achieved everything, many chefs spend their lives chasing: recognition, respect, freedom, the ability to travel anywhere in the world. But success does not erase the things you carry with you. As a chef, this is the part of Anthony Bourdain's story that has always stayed with me. Because from the outside looking in, he had everything. He was living the dream every chef secretly imagines. The chef from New York who escaped the grind, who went from endless nights on the line to exploring the greatest cuisines and cultures on earth. He had the respect of every chef in the industry because he had lived the life they knew. He was traveling the world, connecting with people, sharing meals, and telling stories. At the time of his passing, personally, I was running a restaurant in New York, just a few blocks from where he once cooked at Les Halles. It was impossible not to look at his life and think, how could someone who had found all of this still be suffering? And maybe that's the lesson we needed to hear. Maybe we weren't listening closely enough. Because when we remember Anthony Bourdain, we often remember the places, the countries, the food, the adventures. But if you actually listened to him, he was telling us something much deeper. He wasn't someone who had escaped the darkness. He was someone who understood it.
It's been a wild ride. A lot of miles, a road sometimes smooth, sometimes hard and ugly. And I guess I could tell you that if you look hard enough, that just next door is just as interesting as the other side of the world. But that's not exactly true. If I do have any advice for anybody, any final thought, if I'm an advocate for anything, it's to move as far as you can, as much as you can, across the ocean or simply across the river. The extent to which you can walk in somebody else's shoes or at least eat their food, it's a plus for everybody. Open your mind, get up off the couch, move.
For Anthony Bourdain, travel was never about collecting destinations. It was about understanding people, about realizing that the person on the other side of the world, or the person sitting across the street, had a story worth hearing. That though we may not understand their language or culture or cuisine, that we are all really not that much different. And maybe that was the greatest thing he ever gave us. Not a restaurant, not a recipe, not a television show. A reminder to pay attention. On June 8th, 2018, Anthony Bourdain died by suicide. He was in France, filming an episode of Parts Unknown. The reaction was immediate. Chefs, cooks, servers, writers, and millions of people who had never met him felt like they had lost someone they knew. Because in some way, we all had. His death forced the industry to confront something it had ignored for generations: the culture of silence. The expectation that cooks should simply endure. The idea that suffering was part of the job. The conversation around mental health in the hospitality continues today. Not because Anthony Bourdain had all the answers, but because he helped people finally ask the questions. Anthony Bourdain spent his life trying to understand the world. But the final question he left behind was whether we were willing to understand each other. Anthony Bourdain never became the greatest chef in the world. He wasn't trying to. His legacy was never built on Michelin stars, or restaurants, or dishes that changed cuisine. His legacy was something different. He made an entire industry feel seen. He gave cooks a voice. He gave travelers a reason to look closer. And he reminded millions of people that food was never just about what was on the plate. It was about the people around it. For most of his life, Anthony Bourdain thought he would be remembered as a line cook. Instead, he became something much rarer: the voice of an industry, the storyteller of a generation, and the person who taught the world that sometimes the most important thing you can do is sit down, share a meal, and listen. Anthony Bourdain spent his career showing the world that food was never just about what was on the plate. It was about the stories behind it, the cultures that created it, and the people who shared it. But one chef took that idea and transformed it into something the world had never seen before. A chef who blended two cultures, created an entirely new style of cuisine, and changed the way the world experienced Japanese food. Next time on Chef Legacies, Nobu Matsuhisa. Thanks for watching, and if there's a chef whose story and legacy deserves to be told, leave them in the comments below.